presentation today. If we go to the next screen, it should say my name there. My name is Trobliger. I'm a neuropsychologist with the Northeast Regional Epilepsy Group. That means my job is to do evaluations of people to see how their cognitive functioning is. That is to say, I'm interested in seeing how attention and memory and language and visual, spatial, and visual motor functions, or what we call executive functions, might be affected by some sort of organic dysfunction, in this case, seizure activity. And then what kind of impact it might have on the person's life, whether it be work or school or social issues, things like that, and to try to come up with some recommendations to see how we can help people. Okay, next, we go to the next screen. Should say seizures and academic difficulties. So in this case, we're particularly concerned about seizures and academic difficulties. What kind of effect might the seizures during childhood and adolescence have on a person's school performance? Let's go next. So you can see there, seizures and cognitive difficulties. Okay, so for people with a history of seizures, especially ongoing seizures, we tend to see that they have trouble in a couple different areas. I mentioned here a few of them. You can see their attention, memory, executive issues, and language issues. But really, attention and memory are certainly one of the biggest areas of complaints for people with seizures. We know this both amongst kids and adults. Now, for kids, this is going to be particularly problematic because if you're having problems with attention, there's going to be problems focusing and therefore paying attention in the classroom. That, combined with problems with memory, means there's going to be problems remembering what you've learned in the classroom, maybe necessarily applying it, whether it be on homework, tests, or quizzes, or projects, but overall you can see
the broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Oh boy, okay. I hope everybody's there. Teacher, did we start over?
Yes, I think we started over, so sorry about that. If you can just start with the first page, which is seizure and cognitive difficulties. And again, sorry for everybody for these technical issues, but we should be able to have everybody back online now, okay?
Okay. All right, well, let me just, at the risk of repeating myself, what I was talking about was amongst people with a history of seizures, particularly kids and adults, we see that there's an impact on their cognitive function. And you can see there's a number of different areas, attention and memory and executive issues and language issues. And certainly amongst people, attention and memory seem to be some of the biggest concerns. And then you can guess that if there's a problem with attention, it's going to affect how well the child's going to be able to focus in the classroom, and that's going to affect how well they can learn the lessons that the teacher's presenting. Not to mention be able to complete any kind of assignments or projects that are going on in the classroom. And then attention and memory, together, they're going to affect how well a person can learn not only in the classroom, but retain the lessons from the classroom and apply them at home during homework. And then attention can affect how well a person can study, and then retain the information too, bring it in to be able to complete any assignments at school or go through any kind of tests or quizzes. So definitely amongst kids, this is a major concern, how much their seizure activity is affecting their ability to learn in the classroom. Now, it's not mentioned here, but another thing we're concerned about is certainly medication. That's certainly an area for the neurologist to be worried about. But I just mentioned it because medications, they're certainly great and appropriate because their job is to control seizure activity. But sometimes there can be side effects, and that can affect how well a student can pay attention in the classroom too. So that's always important to keep an eye on, and always let the neurologist know what's going on with the student so they can make adjustments if it's necessary. Sometimes it's not necessary. There's always a trade-off in terms of seizure control versus side effects, but that's usually an area for the neurologist to be concerned about. Let's jump ahead to the next page. Next page, the associations with other medical issues. I just mentioned this here just because there's a lot of overlap in terms of people with epilepsy that have other kinds of issues. I mentioned their developmental delay. So there can be delay in terms of reaching milestones for motor skills as well as speech skills. And that can certainly affect learning in the classroom too. It might be a need for speech therapy or occupational therapy or physical therapy, all services that can be provided through the school system. I mentioned their autism spectrum disorders. Certainly there's an overlap there. We do see quite a few patients that come in to see us who have a history of seizures. They also fall on the spectrum. These are people who would be criteria for autism or Asperger's disorder, things like this. Certainly children who fall on the spectrum, they're also known for having problems with attention too. Not to mention some behavioral issues that can affect how well they can participate in the classroom and how much special education services are needed. And I also mentioned that also attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Certainly we see a lot of this. Remember I mentioned before about how attention is a problem, not to mention the hyperactivity and impulsivity amongst children with a history of seizures. And as you can guess, this is going to affect how well the person's going to be able to function in the classroom. And then behavioral disorders. Again, not uncommon for kids with a history of seizures to have maybe some aggressive behavior or defiant behavior, oppositional behaviors, in and of themselves, not a direct impact on the person's ability to learn, but can certainly affect how well they can interact in the classroom, and that can affect how well they're going to retain the lessons. So in those cases, maybe some therapy might be warranted. Not necessarily something the school's going to provide, but something for the parents to keep in mind. Let's jump on to the next page. So now we're talking about learning disorders. Also something that's not uncommon amongst kids with a history of seizures. So when I'm talking about learning disorders, I'm talking about a discrepancy between where we expect the person to be and where they actually are in terms of their basic reading skills, which involves not only word reading, but also reading comprehension. Reading comprehension is definitely a big concern because reading affects how well you're going to be able to participate in almost every class, right? I mean, you have to be able to read in language arts, you need to be able to read in math, you have to be able to read in social studies and science. If there's a problem with reading, it's going to affect your functioning in all the classes. There can also be learning disorders in the area of writing, written expression. There can also be learning disorder in the area of mathematics. So when there's learning disorders there, it might be warranted for a student to have a special education in those areas to move at sort of a slower pace. But again, not uncommon amongst kids with a history of seizures. Let's move on to the next page. We're talking about effort. I just mentioned here because we don't always want to think about the psychological issues and the behavioral issues and any kind of organic things resulting in any sort of disorders. Sometimes effort is a big piece of it. How much is the child actually trying? That could certainly be related to frustration with their own weaknesses, deficits, not to mention some frustration with the ongoing seizures themselves. So certainly that's something to address to find out what exactly going on here is that if the child's not working up to their potential, there could be a couple different things going on here. So I think that's an important takeaway message here, to not necessarily think there's just one thing that needs to be addressed. So a lot of times there's several things that need to be addressed. Let's move on to the next page. It should say accommodations and services appropriate. So I think the way the rest of this talk is going to go, I'm going to talk about three main areas. One is the school. What can the school do? What kind of services or accommodations can the school provide? And two, parents. What can parents do to help out their kids? And then three, kids. What can the kids do for themselves? So let's talk about the schools first. Accommodations and services, are they appropriate? It's a good question. Let's jump to the next page. If there's a concern there around parents or school staff starting the process, if there's a concern on somebody's end, whether it be from the parents or the teachers or staff at the school, somebody needs to get the ball rolling to determine what's going on here. Why is this person struggling? An evaluation needs to be done here to determine if services or accommodations are needed. And when I'm talking about services here, I'm talking about special education services, whether it be certain classes that need to be, whether it be self-contained or resource-driven, and accommodations would be maybe like extra time or a separate location for tests. I'll be talking to those about a little bit more later on. But either way, somebody has to start the process going with the school system to determine if the services and accommodations are needed. Let's move on to the next page. IEP versus 504 plan. This comes up a lot. What's the difference? What's needed? What is it? Can you have one or both? We're going to take a look at that. I'm trying to cover all those areas. Let's move on to the next page. What's a 504 plan? You can see there a 504 plan is a plan developed to ensure that a child with a disability under the law and is attending elementary or secondary school gets accommodations that will ensure their academic success and access to the learning environment. So this is legal. This is law. This means that a child who has a disability that's identified under the law, they can get accommodations to make sure that they're going to be able to thrive in the school. So certainly the kids are entitled to it. Okay, let's move on to the next page. So what is a 504? It's part of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which prohibits discrimination based upon a disability and requires that the needs be met as adequately as those that are non-disabled. You can see that second part there. It just means that the schools have an obligation to provide a free, appropriate public education to students, and that for those who have disabilities, have impairment, they need to be able to provide accommodations to work around them. That's an important part there, right there, where it's saying when they have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. It's not necessarily enough for the person to have some sort of disability per se. It has to have some sort of impairment. So we're talking about one or more major life activities. Certainly school would be one of those activities, but it has to majorly impact it. So again, it's not enough for it just to have the disability per se. There has to be some sort of impairment going on there. Let's take a look at the next page, which is Section 504 covers. So again, it covers pupils in the schools, children in the schools. I mentioned that before about how they have to have a physical or mental impairment that limits one or more activities, have a record of such impairment, or be regarded as having such impairment. Let's go on to the next page. Medical diagnosis does not automatically mean you can get services. So again, it's important just to mention, it has to be that it's affecting the person's ability to learn. And how is that determined? Let's move on to the next page. Under 504, you don't have to have formalized testing. So it's not formalized testing per se, which is interesting coming from me, being a neuropsychologist, because I'm all about testing. I'm all about determining what the child's level of functioning is. But certainly it can be a piece of it. But you can see that there's other things. The committee's going to take a look at grades. They're going to take a look at teacher reports. And they're going to take a look at information from parents or maybe other agencies that might be involved in the student's functioning, whether it be medical offices. Certainly that would be a good example of it. State assessment scores, so state testing scores, other tests administered in the school system, observations, whether it be by the teachers or any kind of psychologists that are working with the system, discipline reports, attendance records, health records, any kind of adaptive behavior information. And that's an important part there, which is schools must consider a variety of sources. They don't want to necessarily make this decision on the basis of one piece of information. You want to get a lot of different information to make sure they're considered before making the decision to determine if it's necessary to have a 504 plan. Okay, let's move on to the next page. So, where it says for students with disabilities. So for those who do not require specialized instruction but need the assurance that will receive equal access to public education, a document is created. So what does this mean? It just means here that if the student doesn't necessarily need services per se, like special education services, but they just need accommodations, then the 504 plan is created. This would be more appropriate for kids who don't necessarily have any kind of learning disability, but rather some attention issues. That's usually what we see. That's just a good example of it. Let's move on to the next page. So here's some good examples of some accommodations that we tend to see over and over again amongst kids with the 504 plan. Extra time for tests or quizzes, including state-mandated tests. A separate location for tests or quizzes. Certainly those two are key for kids with a history of seizures because, again, that attention is affected, their ability to focus and get through things in an appropriate amount of time. So the extra time gives them, well, okay, they need a little extra time to process the information. And the separate location is just great because it gets rid of the distractions, because the kids with the attention problems have a hard time screening out the distractions. Redirection as needed, it just means kind of reorienting them in the classroom, teachers kind of bringing them back and helping them focus when they need to. Breaks where they're appropriate in the classroom. And then preferred seating. That just means, putting the student where they will best be able to focus, whether it be at the very front, or maybe off to the side a little bit, but definitely probably not in the back. Somewhere up towards the front of the classroom where they're less likely to be distracted. Okay, let's move on to the next page. The next page we're talking about the IEP. And this is the difference here. So for those who do require specialized instruction, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act controls the requirements. And an IEP stands for Individualized Education Program, is developed. And it's more involved in the 504 plan and requires documentation of measurable growth. And what does that mean? That means when an IEP is developed, there are certain goals that have to be developed that the school and the parents and the child are going to be working towards. And they have to be able to be measured in one way. They have to be quantified. There has to be some data. And they're going to be checking on those goals regularly. There'll be annual goals, and they'll be checking on them regularly throughout the school year to see what kind of progress is being made. And then to determine, well, if certain goals have been met, then they aren't appropriate in the IEP anymore. Then they might consider that maybe certain services aren't needed any longer. Or maybe they still haven't been met, and maybe they need even more services. Maybe they need to consider adding more. So in that regard, the annual goals are very important. Let's move on to the next page. We're talking about IEP. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act ensures that children with disabilities are provided early intervention, special education, and related services. So this is important. This is key here. So for children who have some sort of disability, again, that early intervention is going to be key. I mentioned way back in the beginning developmental disabilities, lagging behind in motor skills or language skills. The early intervention services that are provided through the educational system can make a difference in terms of speech therapy, physical therapy, occupational therapy, and the like. And then special education. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit more. It's the appropriate placement to give an appropriate setting where the child would actually be able to learn. And then related services. And the 504 plan services that I mentioned before, sometimes they can be included in the IEP. Well, we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move on. Let's move on to the next page, where we talk about the IEP. It's a plan developed to ensure the child has a disability that is identified under the law, is attending an elementary or secondary educational institution, they get specialized instruction and related services. So again, it just means, kind of like before, that they have a disability, it's been identified by the law, they get the instruction and services that are needed. Okay. Next page. So what does the IEP team do? Well, kind of like with the 504 plan committee, they're going to take a look at information. They're going to take a look at evaluations, information provided by the parents, classroom-based assessments and observations, present levels, of academic achievement, related developmental needs to determine a couple different things there. If the child actually has a disability, whether the child needs special education-related services, and whether any additions or modifications to services are needed to meet the goals to participate in the general education curriculum. So really that's the goal there. You know, the goal is to try to have the child in the least restrictive environment. They want the child certainly to get the services that they need and the accommodations that they need, but not necessarily to overwhelm them. You know, they want to be able to do as much as they can on their own and provide an appropriate amount of support. And that's really key there. They're trying to find a nice balance between that. Let's take a look at the next page. We'll talk about if it's determined that it's appropriate, the program should be developed within 30 days with parents' agreement, and the program is developed together to determine what's most needed. So again, it's important, it's key there for parents to be involved to make sure that they feel like their child's needs are being met. The next page. So an IEP involves actually providing particular special education services. So an IEP is and accommodations are being provided to their child. And again, also what those goals are. And that's particularly helpful because the parents want to make sure that the goals are appropriate and reasonable. It's something that the child can work towards. And they're at certainly at a level that would be challenging, but also something that they can work toward reasonably. Let's take a look at the next page. So here's some examples of some services. Education in regular classrooms, education in regular classes with supplementary services, or special education-related services. Next page. So here's some examples of some special education classes. So that first one there, talking about an inclusion class or mainstream placement. So this means sometimes being in a mainstream class, but maybe having a special education teacher in the classroom. Maybe it means having an aide in the classroom. The special education teacher will be able to step in and provide extra instruction when it's helpful, when it's necessary. Number two there, the resource room placement. This just means this is usually what's known as like a pull-on sort of classroom. The special education works with a small group of students for a particular subject. Again, just working on to address a person's weaknesses in just a particular area. You remember I mentioned before about like language arts or math, you know, the reading and the writing. So this would be an example of kind of a pull-out class that would be appropriate. And then finally, a self-contained class. Sometimes students have to be removed from the general population for all their subjects, and they have to be in a smaller classroom for more individualized instructions at a different pace. So that would be a concern for students who just need that much more care and that much more individualized attention, and they just have more difficulty moving along with the general population in their other classes. And then sometimes, as you can see on the next page, I'm sorry about the typo there, I should say out-of-district placement. Sometimes a child needs to be moved out of the regular public school system and moved into a school system, a setting that specializes with kids with particular needs. As an example, that's not uncommon. Certain schools deal primarily with kids on the autism spectrum, and they tend to thrive a little bit better there because they provide applied behavioral therapy services, and they're able to work with the kids because they have the experience to work with kids with those special needs. That might be a little bit more difficult for the regular general school system to work with. Let's take a look at the next page. So accommodations. All right. Here's some other examples that are kind of similar to before in terms of what kind of things the school might be able to provide. So it's an aid, whether it's shared amongst other students in the classroom, maybe one-to-one. sometimes particularly one-to-one AT is helpful if there's safety concerns for a child with seizures. They're having ongoing seizures, and they want to make sure the child doesn't injure themselves, or maybe during the seizure they get confused. We want to make sure they're not wandering off. So in that case, an A would be very helpful. Highlighted textbooks, something mentioned down towards the bottom there, enlarged print text. So sometimes text with bigger print might be helpful. Sometimes an extra set of text might be helpful. Having a set at school and a set at home. That's not listed here, but it can be helpful. I mentioned before about extra time on tests or a separate location for tests. We see that in the 504 plan, but also in the IEP. Peer assisted with note-taking, particularly when we get to the higher levels, having somebody who can help out. Not uncommon for teachers to be able to provide notes and review sheets to the students who are having difficulties. Frequent feedback, certainly that's related to the annual goals, but not only that, but also feedback to the student too, to let them know how they're doing. And sometimes the positive reinforcement can be very helpful. Let's move on to the next page. Here's some more accommodations and positive reinforcement. Still the same thing, providing that encouragement that they're doing well, that they're getting it. Behavioral intervention plans, sometimes this is appropriate. If there are behavioral issues in the classroom, whether they're going to be working towards something, some sort of reward system, or taking away certain privileges, that can, sometimes that's necessary. Rearranging class schedules, sometimes this is necessary too. Front-loading certain classes towards the beginning of the day, maybe moving certain classes towards the end of the day, depending on maybe when a child is more likely to have seizures or depending on what their energy level is. Use of visual aids and manipulatives and sort of trying to demonstrate concepts. An opportunity to give answers to tests and quizzes orally. This is particularly helpful for kids who have attention issues, not to mention writing and language issues too. And then an opportunity to have tests and quizzes, the questions read aloud. Again, that can help the students get if there's language issues or attention issues. Except where the reading skills are being assessed directly, then they want to actually take a look and see how their reading skills are. Let's move on to the next page. We sort of covered this already, this idea of annual goals. It's important to have something that the child is working towards, and for them to review those goals, and for them to reevaluate and see what kind of progress is being made towards those goals. And certainly the IEP can be revised every year. Certainly you want to have the teachers and the staff and the special education committee check in with the parents just to make sure what's going on. Let's take a look at the next page. Can you have both an IEP and a 504 plan? This comes up a lot. You don't really need it. I mean, you can see here, if your child has a disability and an IEP, he or she is automatically covered by Section 504. So you wouldn't really need both. If they had an IEP, they're already covered by the 504. The IEP would cover both the services and the accommodations. The IEP would require them to address all the child's needs. So we're covering everything there. We cover everything that would sort of be covered under the 504 plan. But again, you can see here it's good because the IEP also provides the child and the family with more rights and protections than the 504 plan. So the IEP is actually good in that sense because it's more comprehensive and it provides more rights and protections. So the answer is you wouldn't have both of them. It would not be needed. The IEP would sort of supersede the 504 plan. And so in some cases, the 504 plan is all that's necessary if the special education services aren't deemed warranted. Let's move on to the next page. School versus college. Well, this certainly comes up. We see here that elementary and secondary schools, they have to provide a free appropriate public education, so they need to provide services and accommodations to make sure that their needs are being met and they can function as adequately as their peers who don't have any disabilities. But if we move on to the next page, accommodations at the college level, it's a little bit different there because special education services are not going to be provided at the college level. It's just not built that way. And under the law, the college staff really just has to make appropriate adjustments and aids and services to make sure that they have an equal opportunity to participate. They don't have to make adjustments or providing the services that would make a fundamental change in the program or impose an undue burden. So there certainly can be some adjustments in terms of allowing students to maybe write papers instead of taking exams. Again, having extra time and extra different place for the exams is not uncommon. Spacing out exams, spreading them out over the course of several days, it's not uncommon too. But you wouldn't see some sort of special education setting at the college level. It's just a little bit different there. But not uncommon. And it's certainly something for any kind of college students with a history of seizures to take advantage of. Certainly, if they're having difficulties, then they are entitled to these accommodations. They should contact the school's disability office to get that ball rolling. Let's move on to the next page. Parents. Okay. Remember I said I was going to be talking about 3 main areas. I was going to be talking about the school, I was going to be talking about parents, and I was going to be talking about children. So what can the parents do? So certainly reviewing work can be helpful. Unfortunately, kids with a history of seizures have a habit of rushing through things, although all kids have a habit, or I should say most kids have a habit of rushing through things because they want to get through it and have some fun instead of doing their homework. So certainly checking their work and checking it for errors, not necessarily correcting those errors, but underlining the errors, circling the errors so that the child can check them and correct them. And also reminding the student to slow down just in general, and pointing out that if they take the time to do it right the first time, they'll be less likely to have to correct it and spend even more time. Working with the teacher and the school staff is important, regular communication. I know it's a little bit easier to contact staff at this point with regular contact with email, but certainly that is key to find out how everybody is doing so that there's no surprises towards the middle of the year to find out the student is failing. And that's the last thing you want. You want a regular communication to know that if there is a problem, what's going on. Because maybe students might not necessarily be giving all the information to their parents. So you're more likely to get information from the staff, get a full picture. Helping them organize and manage assignments can be helpful. I mentioned way back at the beginning this idea of executive issues. Kids with a history of seizures, sometimes they have problems with planning and organization. So they're going to need a little bit of help in terms of organizing. So that's where parents can be helpful in terms of figuring out. Assignments, let's plan ahead, figure out how much time we need to get assignments done. There's projects coming up. Let's have deadlines. Let's have some sort of calendar so we know what we're working with, how much time we have. The next part here where I talk about helping get started on tasks and moving back and helping as needed. I think this is key. This is very helpful. For kids who have problems or the material is challenging, it's okay to help them get started, but I think that's it. Once you get them started, then you pull back a little bit and say, okay, well, what do you think we should do next? And sometimes they have an idea, but sometimes they're embarrassed. They don't want to be wrong. You just say, well, what do you think your idea is? And if they're right, that's great. And if they're not right, well, you say, okay, I see how you might think that, but let's try this instead. So the idea is, again, to step in, provide support and help where it's needed, and back off, move away when it's not needed. Sort of a laddering type of system. Checking work. Okay, I just put that in there again because it's very important. Next page, parents. Providing assistance as needed, moving back when not. And I mentioned that before already. Okay, so students. Now we're going to move into the third area. So for students, what can they do? To sort of survive and thrive in the school system. That's where our title here is. Doing homework and studying and completing projects in the right environment. That's certainly key. If you're going to be working in some sort of room where there's a lot of distractions, it's going to be hard to get through. So sometimes having the internet on, not a good idea. Sometimes having the phone nearby, not necessarily a good idea. TV's on, radio's on. These are all distractions, and it's hard to sort of weed them out. So it's a good idea to turn off the TV or turn off the radio. Some people like having a little bit of white noise in the background, like maybe classical music, a little bit soft, maybe like a fan, just to provide a little bit of buffer noise in the background. That can be helpful, certainly. I know one person regarding her phone, she likes to turn it off, not off per se, but turn the ringer off and have it face down so that she doesn't actually see any sort of messages. It's not a distraction. And then when she's taking a break, she can check it. That's not a bad idea. But again, the idea is you're avoiding distractions, closing the door, having a nice, quiet place to work. Next page. Learning to take breaks and switch between assignments. This is key. For students who are struggling and sort of banging their heads and getting more and more frustrated with trying to get through some sort of project or studying or homework, that's their brain telling them this is a good time to take a break. So whether that's like a brief break, you don't want to turn a break into like an hour or so, but a couple minutes is a good idea. Give your brain a chance to rest. Or sometimes it's a good idea just to switch between assignments. So if you're working on math and you're having trouble with it, put it aside for a while. Let's go do something else for now. Let's do some reading and get the reading done, and then go back to the math after you kind of give your brain a chance to rest. See, the idea is not to keep frustrating the student, not to keep frustrating the child, but rather give them a chance to put that aside. Let's get back to it a little bit later. Next page. Spreading out reading assignments and spreading out projects. This is just a good point in general. And this applies to not only amongst kids with seizures. In fact, I would argue that a lot of these things have not only amongst with kids with seizures, but anybody. In terms of just talking about study skills in general at this point, the idea of spreading things out. Just cramming in general is not a good idea. Just in general, but certainly amongst kids with a history of seizures who need a little bit more time to learn information. and to process the information, trying to learn things at the last minute is not a good idea. So the repetition would be key for them. So when we're talking about studying, it would be good to study for a couple days before you have a quiz or test, rather than just cramming it over the night before. You know, there's a big difference between studying maybe like a half an hour, a couple nights, versus studying for like 3 or 4 hours in a row the night before an exam. We also just know in general, during sleep, your brain is going to process the information that you've learned. So the more time you have, the more time you're giving your brain to process the information overnight. Spreading out reading assignments too, this is key, just in terms of not trying to process too much information at once. So when we're talking about taking breaks, sometimes it means, if the assignment's small enough, just taking a break at the end of a section or at the end of a chapter and then thinking about, well, what did I just read? But if it's big enough, sometimes that means spreading a reading assignment over the course of a couple nights, reading a chapter here or a section one night and another section the next night. And it really depends on how long that assignment is. And then spreading out projects. Again, this is key, not waiting until the last minute to get something done, but figuring out when you have a project, how do I break this down? What are the different steps here? So like, for example, with writing a paper. All right, well, I got to do some research. There's one step. I need to write an outline, what I'm going to be writing about. There's 2. There's number 3, writing a first draft. Number 4, writing another draft. And then 5, writing a final draft. You'd be adding any kind of reference and things like that. Depends on the level the student's at. But you can see there that I broke it down. So that means not doing a project over the course of one day, but maybe doing one section of that project each night and giving yourself time, again, to really work on the project rather than rushing through. Okay, next page, studying versus cramming. I mentioned this before about how your brain needs time to process it, but we've also seen some research on this too. And people will swear up and down that cramming is better. They work better under pressure, but the research tells us otherwise. People in general are better when they take more time to study and learn the information rather than cram it all in at the last minute. They're more likely to retain more information, and they're more likely to retain more information over the long run too, which is really what we want the students to do. They don't want just to learn the information for the test. We want them to learn the information, period, and retain it, not only for the final exam at the end of the year, but ideally, as long as possible. Knowledge. Let's move on to the next page. Studying together. That can be certainly helpful. This is something that I mentioned before. This idea of working with somebody can be very helpful. Testing yourself is good. Quizzing yourself to see what you've already learned, it's great. But if somebody can test you, if somebody can quiz you, and you're forced to articulate what you've learned, well, then you've really mastered it. If you can explain to somebody what something is, then you've figured it out. You have the material down. That's good. That's a good way to learn something. Likewise, when you hear somebody else try to explain it, it can help the student try to learn the information in a new way. Maybe they're having trouble grasping it. Somebody else putting the information in different terms can make a huge difference in terms of how well they learn. So I'm a big fan of studying together. Doesn't even have to necessarily be together in the same room. Certainly with the technology we have now, it can be done over the phone, it can be done with webcams, but the principle is still the same, learning together. Next page, quizzing self and studying. I mentioned that before, this idea of, so if you don't have a partner, just the idea of quizzing yourself. Pausing and thinking about what have I learned, what are the concepts here, maybe writing down what you remember, and then quizzing yourself and seeing if you've written down all the concepts that you need can be helpful. So quizzing yourself too. So not just trying to learn the information, but actually checking to see if you've actually learned the information. Schedules, organizers, and phones. I'm on the next page, I'm sorry. Schedules, organizers, and phones. This is just a matter of, again, for planning and organization. Sometimes the parent needs to step in and help them in terms of trying to figure out how to get organized. But certainly with the technology we have now, it's a little bit easier for students to get organized. With their phones, the phones have alarm systems on them and calendar functions, so there can be periodic reminders about getting things done. Now, the phones in themselves are only as good as if the student actually uses them, but certainly it's a very good tool for reminding people to get things done. And organizers, that just means, again, just kind of keeping information where it's supposed to be. So sometimes that can be something as simple as a folder that's devoted towards a subject, or maybe when they're younger, just any subject, any kind of homework. But for the student to learn, when I'm done with my stuff, my homework, I put it here, so that when I get to school tomorrow and I have to turn something in, I know where it is. I'm not searching in my book bag, I'm not looking at my books, I'm not looking at my notebooks, I know where it is. It's the idea of organization, knowing where your things are. And it can be very helpful, especially when the student's younger. Practice these sort of study skills. Next page. Folders and assignment notebooks, we talked about that already, just making sure the places are where they're supposed to be. Next page, time management, 2 times principle. This idea is just, in general, it's a good idea for students to plan for twice as much time as they think they might need. If their first instinct is to think, you know what, I'm only going to need a day to get this project done. Well, we've already talked about they probably should spread out the projects anyway, so they're probably wrong about that. They probably should take at least 2 days. But whatever it is, whatever their first instinct is to think they need that much time, they probably actually need twice as much time to get it done, and then they should plan accordingly. Now, that in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing to have extra time, because one, you might have the extra time, you might need the extra time to review it and check it, have somebody else take a look at it. But it's also sort of better to have the thing done in advance as opposed to working at the last minute. So the 2 times principle can be very helpful. Making checklists of assignments and projects, placing on the calendar, planning ahead critical points. This goes back again to the principle of organization and just having certain dates to work towards. And again, being organized and having some sort of visual aid, a calendar to look at and knowing when a project is coming up so that there aren't any surprises. So you don't get that sort of panic, oh, I have this project due tomorrow. Well, you already know about it. But that can also be helpful regarding getting information from the teachers to know what kind of projects are coming out. So everybody sort of has to work together on that point. Next page, surviving in college. So a lot of the principles that I talked about already can be applied at the college level, but there's a couple different things that we can talk about besides that. Meeting with college advisors regarding classroom. For students with a history of seizures, maybe taking a full-time class load might not be the best idea, at least at first. So trying to figure out what would be appropriate, what can the student handle, and if they get through with like 1 or 2 classes and they do okay, well, let's add some more the next semester. Just trying to figure out what the person's comfort level is, as opposed to jumping in and getting overwhelmed and maybe not passing some classes and getting off to a bad start. A little bit better to probably ease into things, maybe take a little bit longer to get through college, but doing it right, learning the information and getting better grades as opposed to getting overwhelmed. Meeting with the college disability office regarding accommodations. I mentioned that in the beginning. It's important to contact the disability office to let them know what the medical history is and see what kind of accommodations you're entitled to. Learning to sit at the front of the class, rather. This is a matter of, instead of the school doing it, just learning it. Sometimes you need to do it. You need to sit in front and avoid those distractions. You're less likely to be distracted, looking out the window, be checking your phone or things like that when you're at the front of the class as opposed to the back. Going over material in advance of the classes, so making sure you're reading material so that you're prepared. So when it's time for the class, some of the material seems familiar. And then asking questions, not hesitating to ask questions, whether it's during the class or after the class or with the teaching assistants, but making use of the services. And I think the teaching assistants can be very key, especially if they have extra hours or if the professor has hours, not to make sure that you make use of them and not to feel like you're burdening them, because really that's their job to provide that time. So going in and asking questions, asking for help as you need it. Next page. So conclusions. So surviving and thriving in school involves a couple different things. We talked about how it's key that the school staff in terms of providing the services and accommodations and working with the school to see what kind of appropriate plan is needed. We talked about parents being able to provide the support and the help and the encouragement as they're needed. And we talked about the students, the kind of things that they can do on their own too, just in terms of being able to work on their study skills and their planning skills and their organization skills. But overall, so what does surviving and thriving in school involve? Next page. The services provided by the school system, which we talked about. We talked about the IEP and the 504 plan, whether it be some sort of special education classes or the different accommodations that we talked about. That can be helpful, so you get that sort of structure from the school. Next page. Assistance, guidance, and support provided by the parents. Not to be undervalued. I think parents can play a key role in here, not only in terms of making sure that the school is giving them the services that they need, but providing that support at home. And doesn't necessarily mean doing the homework for the student, doesn't necessarily mean studying with the student, although sometimes that's warranted and sometimes that's needed, but helping out when it's needed and moving back when it's not needed any longer. And then finally, next page, different approaches to learning and studying by students. I think this is key here too. I talked before about a lot of different approaches, a lot of different study skills that students can try. This isn't a sort of one-size-fits-all. There are different students who are going to figure out they have different needs and different ways of studying. And sometimes Kids, particularly when they get older, they figure they're not so good working right when they get to school. They have to wait until a little bit later in the day. Sometimes, particularly in college, they figure out they need to front load their classes, get them toward the beginning of the day, because by the end of the day they're exhausted. Some people are a little bit more night owls. They have to wait towards the end of the day when they feel like they can function a little bit better. Some people study a little bit better at night. Some people study a little bit better at morning. So again, but your mileage may vary. But I think a lot of the key principles there about getting rid of the distractions, that's key. The idea of not cramming, the idea of spreading things out, that's certainly key too, in terms of being able just to get through your classes and be able to study and get through any kind of projects. And that, I think, my friend, is the end of the presentation. Tijan, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. Again, I want to thank Robert Trobliger for the great presentation he gave it to us. I know there was some kind of technical difficulties even from you guys in there, but we are going to be uploading this presentation to our website at the Northeast Regional Epilepsy Group by next week. And I should be able to get it much better, like in regard to PowerPoint, because I know what kind of difficulty for everybody probably from the other end. But we should be able to get it ready by next week for you guys. Again, I want to thank Robert Trobliger for his great presentation from the Northeast Regional Epilepsy Group, and I wish everybody a great evening.
It was my pleasure, and like you said, if there's any questions, make sure they have them your way, and I'll see if I can answer them.
Great. Thanks a lot.
All right.
Thanks,
Take care,
everybody.
everyone.
Thank you.